behind the controls. So if you've got questions, shoot them Bob's way, or chime in on the comments, and we'll be able to answer questions. I think probably the best way to do this, we have a lot to cover, so probably the best way to do this is to for me to pause at the end of each section and see if there are any questions that Rob has received, and then we can answer them in that way. So this is of course our Facebook Live event for this week, and we've had a lot of fun visiting with y'all virtually and talking about Civil War America virtually the last month and a half or so. We've got a full slate of things coming up for May. I can run through some of the highlights. Next Tuesday on May 5th, same time, 2 o'clock, Pete and I will be together talking about Samuel Simon Schmucker. The next week, Pete will be talking about African American history, particularly in South Central Pennsylvania. Then we'll have another Facebook Live on May 19th. Right now we have Dr. Chris Moore, who's just finished a fantastic book on J. William Jones, one of the most influential chaplains in Lee's army. He'll be with us talking about his book and about J. William Jones. Fascinating stuff, great work, long overdue, and a really fantastic treatment of one of the most important but least well-known Confederate thought leaders from the wartime period and beyond. So looks like a great conversation. And then on the 26th, Pete will be talking about W.W. King's Civil War. And then for members on the 27th, we're going to do another one of our happy-hour events. So if you're not a member already, go on over to the Facebook or our website and join up. You'll get some special content. You'll get access to these happy hour events that we do every 3 weeks or so. And this time we'll be out walking around on the Gettysburg battlefield and talking about elements of the first day's fight. So that's what we've got coming up. But today we've got a pretty difficult topic, quite frankly. And it's one that we don't think of very often. But you hear us, especially me, reference the pro-slavery theology pretty regularly when I talk about Confederate chaplains and religion and the Confederate experience. So I thought Chris Graham spoke some about that too when we were together a couple of weeks ago. So we thought it would be a good idea to sort of give an overview of the pro-slavery theology from the perspective of the 1810s, 20s, 30s, 40s. And into the war era in the 1850s and 60s. So to get into this, it's important to kind of back up. So what I want to do is I've chosen 3 reasonably prominent, I'd call them mid-level, well, at least in 2 cases, mid-level pro-slavery theologians and 1 pretty major theologian. But I want to talk about 3 people. I want to talk about Basil Manny. I want to talk about Eisen Brooks. And I want to talk about Charles Colcott Jones. And these are men who were both parish ministers, local congregations, led education institutions, and wrote fairly extensively at a popular level about the rightness of slavery interpreted through a biblical lens. And so these guys are very influential both at a regional and national level, and then very much so in a local congregational level. So, in fact, some of these guys are men who had preached before the soldiers who are in Abner Perrin's brigade that captures the seminary on July 1st. So there's a really direct connection between the seminary building itself and some of these ideas. So, but before we do that, I think it's kind of important to look fairly broadly at the context in which the pro-slavery theology developed, because it really doesn't become a mature and broadcast way of thinking until the 1810s or 20s. But it has a serious foundation, deep roots in the early Republic, in the years immediately after the American Revolution. I'm most familiar with the way that it plays out in Georgia. And you see very early in Georgia even before the advent of the perfected cotton gin by Eli Whitney, you see in the areas that become the cotton belt of Georgia in the 1810s and 20s, you see a very hierarchical conception of society being articulated by Baptist ministers in the area, and the Baptists become the dominant denomination in that part of Georgia in the 10s, 20s, and through the 30s especially. And even before, though, you begin to see the broad implementation of gang labor and using enslaved persons to grow short staple cotton. You see Federalist ministers, Baptist ministers especially, writing about hierarchy and writing about how deism is a threat to the new union, that a nation state not founded on or informed by the biblical scriptures is one that's certainly going to upturn society. They were concerned that the refuse of society, to use Henry Holcomb words, were going to bubble to the top of society and try to enforce their will. They were concerned with the types of disorder that they'd seen in the French Revolution, both in the newspapers and in a practical way, with immigrants, with people with white French colonists fleeing the rebellion in Saint Domingue. They're coming into Augusta, Georgia, which is right in the middle of the Cotton Belt of Georgia and the Cotton Belt of South Carolina. So they're actually talking to people who had fled the slave uprising in Saint Domingue and had really serious concerns that become articulated through using religious language about this uprising of people. But the Baptists, especially in that part of Georgia and South Carolina, were Calvinists. They were they were particular Baptists. If you're familiar with the difference between separates and particulars, the particulars are very stayed very Calvinistic, very structured, even though they are Baptist and have a fairly loose ecclesiology. So, in any case, that's the main influence in this part of Georgia. So, and in South Carolina. So you already have this hierarchical vision of society, the right levels of subjection, models of family and marriage are very hierarchical in this context. The notion of a patriarchal head of a household is an image that even before slavery becomes the dominant mode of production is popular in this part of the world. So it's important to think about what the intellectual antecedents to the pro-slavery theology were and what kind of society that this begins to take root in. So in any case, the idea of biblical support of slavery does develop in the late 18th and early part of the 19th century, but really does not take on a tremendous amount of forward momentum until the late 1820s, early 1830s, with the development of large organizations calling for immediate abolition. You can really pretty much date the beginning of the rise of a very clearly articulated pro-slavery theology developing after 1831 and the beginning of the publication of the newspaper Liberator, which is calling for immediate emancipation. And so and he's using biblical and abolitionist ministers using biblical texts to argue against slavery, and white Southern ministers respond in kind, and they use a literalist interpretation of the Bible to argue that slavery was the biblical way of organizing society, and even in some cases even arguing that it was the only foundation for Republican government. Very serious articulations of this begin in the late 1820s, early 1830s, 1840. So this has become the dominant way of thinking about biblical text and thinking about society, so it becomes the way that people are being ministered to in churches, all churches, Baptist, Methodist, Episcopal, all Presbyterian, all are in one way or another involved as pro-slavery theology. There's some pretty important high-level theologians who are teaching at major theological institutions and seminaries in the South. Thornton Stringfellow, James Henry Thornwell, William Capers, Patrick Hughes Mell. Across this period, they write long books. They write very important newspaper and magazine articles that really outline in some detail the tenets of this. They teach in the theological seminaries. They are the ones who are leading the perfection of the pro-slavery theology. So, but not to simplify things too much, but when you think of the pro-slavery theology and you think of its origin point and you think of the biblical warrants that are most often used, and we'll see these time and again with the three people we'll look at, but there are two major biblical texts or stories from the Bible that are used by these pro-slavery theologians to make the case, to start the case for slavery as a biblically approved institution. The first is the story of the curse of Ham. This is the idea that when Noah was drunk and his sons Shem, Japheth, and Ham came and saw him naked, that Ham laughed, that the other two brothers covered Noah, and when Noah sewed up, he cursed Ham, said, "You'll be servant of servants," and cast him, according to this interpretation, cast him into Africa, where he led the Canaanites. And the Canaanites in this version are people from sub-Saharan Africa. And that is, we'll get around that when we talk about Ives and Brooks. There's some pretty blood-chilling stuff that he says based on this curse of Ham story about African-descended people. And that story, though, is at the very center of most of this pro-slavery theology. There's this Noahic curse that had made one race of people, according to this interpretation, the servants of servants forever. The other primary source that's used from a biblical text is Paul's injunction on assignments, and it's essentially on assignments as an enslaved member of church, and he runs away. He leaves his master, and Paul tells him to go back to your master. You owe him subjection, and so you have to go back. So those are the two positive injunctions used time and again by these theologians. There are negative examples given as well. We'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But the negative example is that none of the apostles nor Jesus said anything about slavery being wrong. So there's a negative example in the Bible too. The argument goes, if they had meant to get rid of the slavery, they had plenty of opportunities in the New Testament, under the New Testament dispensation, the gospel dispensation, to say that slavery was wrong, but they didn't, and therefore we have to continue interpreting this in light of what we've seen in the Old Testament, with the curse of Ham, and then certainly with the positive injunction by Paul to on assignments. So those are the three main ways that these ministers and theologians start their arguments as the foundation point. So, if Rob, are there any questions at this point? That's kind of the quick overview of where this thinking came from.
Not at this time.
No questions at all. Okay, well, I'm glad that it's perfectly clear. So what I want to do now, I want to talk about three ministers who were pro-slavery in their outlook, slightly differently, one from the other. They have different ways of getting around to it. They all get to the same point, and that God means for African people of African descent, to be slaves of white people in North America, United States. So they all get to that point. They all have slightly different takes on exactly what that means. But going to the same place. So the first person we'll talk about is Basil Manley, or Basil Manley. He was born in 1798 in North Carolina, and from a family that ends up being fairly prominent in North Carolina history. Basil's older brother Charles ended up as governor of North Carolina, and his younger brother became the Supreme Court justice. So this is not a family of ill means, and certainly not an intellectually deficient family. They are leaders in North Carolina, and Basil himself becomes a leader first in South Carolina and then out in Alabama. So Basil goes to a private academy in Orange County, North Carolina. He then goes on to South Carolina College, which later becomes the University of South Carolina. He pursues a degree there and graduates as the valedictorian in 1821. Just before he goes to South Carolina College, he experiences a conversion, and he relates his conversion to the Baptist church that he belonged to, and became a full member of the Baptist church in 1814. He thought that very quickly thereafter that he had a calling for the ministry. He believed that that was his path in life. And he pursues this. He pursues pretty diligently his call. He moves in there's some places that are very, very important to this whole story. And Edgefield District, South Carolina is one of those places where you come back time and time again. You end up circling around Edgefield and Richmond County, Georgia, and Columbia, South Carolina, and Charleston, South Carolina. And later on Greenville, South Carolina, when you're thinking about this pro-slavery theology. Manley moves to the Edgefield District in 1821. He's been ordained, he's ordained in 1822, and he leads a major revival in Edgefield District, South Carolina. And it's not too long after that the revival moves across the river in Augusta, and then in this plantation district around Augusta, between Augusta and Athens, and it really marks the turning point for evangelical religion in that part of Georgia and South Carolina. Prior to this 1822, 1828 period, there were a tremendous number of church members. Remember that evangelicalism comes late to the South. And when it does, it speaks with a particular accent. And Manley is one of these early speakers who made a tremendous lot of difference in the development of Baptist and Methodist and Presbyterian affiliation in Georgia and South Carolina. Not too long after, and in fact in 1826. Just as the revival is kicking off in Georgia, Manley is given the leadership of the First Baptist Church in Charleston, South Carolina, which is one of the most important Baptist churches in early America. Richard Furman hand-selected Manley to lead the church after he retired. And Manley goes down and he preaches at First Baptist in Charleston from 1826 to 1837. He really grew the church dramatically, promoted the denomination nationally, became a national leader, which is not surprising given the prominence of his pulpit. He serves as the leader of the Triennial Convention, which is the national organization of Baptists through the 1830s. But he helps to create both Furman University and then later the Southern Baptist Seminary in Greenville, South Carolina. He's a pretty influential guy in South Carolina. It's interesting that he is the leader of the Triennial Convention, because that's a national organization that splits in 1845 over slavery. And Manley is right at the center of that. Now, in 1836, he's moved on to Alabama, He takes the position as the second president or third president or second president of the University of Alabama, leads the institution, and at the same time he's leading the institution and growing the institution, making some pretty serious changes to the University of Alabama. He continues to preach. He preaches at the Tuscaloosa Baptist Church, and he also does no way to call it, his missionary work around the region. So he's out preaching, he's out teaching in the 30s and the 40s. He's still maintaining this high profile in the National Baptist denomination, and works through 1845 with the Triennial Convention. But when the controversy over appointing slaveholding missionaries breaks out amongst the Baptists in 1844 and 1845, it's Manly who makes the strongest argument for division. It's called the Alabama Resolutions. There are a series of demands that he wrote that called for a separate Southern Baptist denomination, and they're successful in breaking away. They meet in Augusta, Georgia in 1845 and create the Southern Baptist Convention, which still exists today. So he's a principal leader in the split of the denomination, one of the harbingers of the larger national divisions that were beginning to appear in American life. Manly himself, and I'm sure you're probably wondering how many slaves did Manly own himself, and he owned 40 slaves that we know of. He had a plantation along the Black Warrior River in western Alabama. So he was deeply involved in the system. And not surprisingly, all three of these guys that we're going to talk about today would have been considered large planters, even at the time, even during their lives. All of them owned more than 60 enslaved people in multiple plantations. So these guys, they live within the system. They are a part of the system, and they're intellectual and faith leaders within this larger social network, larger cultural network, this emerging cultural network, this increasingly defensive social and cultural network. So what do we know about what Manly thinks? So we left a good number of sermons behind. And one of the reasons I wanted to do Manly rather than say Stringfellow is that we know that Manly is getting down to the granular level of congregational preaching when he's talking about his pro-slavery views and his understanding of the Bible as a pro-slavery document. So all three of these guys that I'm talking about today carried this message not simply to theologians and people graduating the colleges and in the South. There are people who are preaching in pulpits all across the South. So one of I think probably the best example of Manly's writing about his pro-slavery views come in 1845. He writes a sermon and publishes a pamphlet called The Servant, Duties of the Masters and Servants. Sorry, I was reading from a different paragraph. Duties of the Masters and Duties of Masters and Servants, and that's interesting because this idea of a relationship that would imply duties on both parts is something that's new in the pro-slavery thinking in the 1840s, and it's very much influenced by Charles Colcock Jones, who will finish up this little jaunt through pro-slavery theology. We'll finish up with talking about Charles Colcock Jones. But anyway, what Manly is trying to achieve here is he's defending the institution. He certainly sees it as God ordained, but he also believes that the hardships of slavery, he certainly has seen this because he's a slave owner himself. The hardships of slavery had to be tempered by Christian behavior. He wanted the masters to treat enslaved better. He felt that the masters had duties to slaves to treat them well and to provide opportunities for religious instruction. which is again is something of a change. And remember, the 18th century and really kind of echoing through the first part of the 19th century, the sense that enslaved people could gain freedom or make a moral case against slavery by using religion was something that kept whites from engaging enslaved people in conversations about religion. It's not until a little bit later in the 19th century that you start to see these efforts to create what Colcott Jones calls a sacred community of obligation. Seeing this in sermon form and then in pamphlet form tells us something about the ways that these ideas are being extended into larger, broader audiences, and I think that's important to keep in mind. The society that these guys are trying to imagine and trying to put together intellectually and culturally and through biblical text is very much the society that Reverend Renfro kind of imagined when the sermon that we talked about a couple of weeks ago to the 10th Alabama. This is the theorizing of that society and of that set of relationships. So what's he say in Duties of Masters and Servants is kind of standard stuff in a lot of ways. It's very much rooted in the story of Onesimus and Paul. He says that slave owners should treat enslaved workers fairly, provide for their spiritual well-being, take care of their physical needs. And he reconciles this all, and this is an important theme throughout. I remember years ago, Don Matthews, the great historian of American religion at the University of North Carolina, after a conference paper, says, don't ever forget that in the South, it's all about Calvinism. How do you adapt to Calvinism? How do you take even denominations that weren't necessarily Calvinistic in their form of theology? How does Calvinism influence the way that these denominations function? And Calvinism in predestination, the idea of hierarchies and hierarchies of people is very important. We can go into Calvinism. Maybe we'll do Calvinism another time. But in any case, this idea that there's a doctrine of duty and an acceptance of one's place in God's divine plan is key to the ways that Manley is putting this together, because what he's doing is simply making the argument, this is the society that God has ordained, get with the program. And he's telling this to planters and to enslaved people alike. He's suggesting, and Colcott Jones is the same way, suggesting that planters have a lot of work to do to create the kind of slave system that can persist. So, and that's an important key here, is that they're defending this society that's increasingly out of step with the rest of the world, with the United States and with the rest of the world. Manley argues that the owners and enslaved people should balance rewards and punishment. That they should be holding out the hope of life eternal in heaven, as well as holding out examples of kindness on earth. So there's again this injunction on for slave owners to change their ways in some ways. He says that, and this is a quote, he says, slavery is kind of a patriarchal government, partaking in some respects of the character of paternity. So you have patriarchal heads of the household drawn from the Old Testament. You have this family image, this familial responsibility of the heads of households, which were always men, largely men in the South, and certainly in the ways that the churches ordered things. The men were the head of the household, women were to support, to keep quiet in church, and to be helpmeets. And this notion of a patriarchal government and paternity and family and these family relationships and ideas of family are all through the pro-slavery theology, and Manley comes right out and says it just as clear as can be. But he also reminds both the enslaved and the slave owners. He said, God has made you their masters, placed them under your protection, and made you their guardians, the conservators of their lives and happiness. So he tells them what the responsibilities of that patriarchal leader of a household, because he's weaving this narrative of the patriarchs of the Old Testament leading large families, not just their families by marriage blood, but also larger families of dependents. He argues that there's going to be a, quote, mutual advantage and satisfaction that will arise out of this relationship in the proper discharge of its duties, and all would be led to faithfulness and duty from the prospect held out to the good of possessing in common the inherent and dwelling place of heaven. So again, what he's trying to convince people of, and what he's trying to make an argument to the people who are listening to the people who are watching from outside, is that the owners have the interest of the enslaved people in mind, that they're acting like Old Testament patriarchs, and that they are executing their Christian duty to take care of these people because they have a responsibility to do so, because God ordained this social system, and for this social system to work, they had to adjust themselves somewhat. This is kind of a hallmark of what Manley is saying about slavery in the Bible. Kind of hits the high points of the themes. Manley is an important character in the history of the Confederacy. He is selected to give the invocation at the inauguration of Jefferson Davis for the time that he was in Montgomery by this time, or goes to Montgomery this time. He opened congressional sessions while the Confederates' capital was in Montgomery, and really maintained this reputation as one of the most important religious leaders in the Confederacy, sometimes called the chaplain of the Confederacy or chaplain to the Confederacy. He continued on until they moved to Richmond, and he did see the Confederate government as being a fulfillment of this social vision and this biblical vision that he had been outlining for at least the 20 years previous. He he continues to work during the war, but he has a stroke in 1864, and he retires from the field in 1864 and dies then in December of 1868. So his career is done by the time that just about the time that the Confederacy is collapsing. But a very important figure, both at the parish level, the national level, the state level in South Carolina and Georgia. Very influential man in this idea of paternity and patriarchal government and due subjection are keys to understanding how he put together his version of pro-slavery theology. Rob, is there any questions yet?
Yes, there are. Give me 1 second. I've got a great one for the end, and then a good one for right now.
Okay.
Notice any difference in the pro-slavery theology of Methodists and Episcopalians who did this, but were not Calvinists?
There's not. They use the same texts, and they use the same arguments. You can read. I think probably the best analog to Manley would be Patrick Hughes Mell, who's at the University of Georgia. I almost used Mell, but I didn't want to do too much Georgia. Mell is a Methodist. He ends up as the professor of moral philosophy at the University of Georgia in the late 1850s. There's still buildings named after Mell over there in Athens, and Mell makes exactly the same kinds of arguments, reasons from the same biblical texts. And remember that this notion of Calvinism, while it's not formally a part of what the Methodists are doing, they certainly have to move a little bit closer to the Calvinist notion of hierarchy and the depravity of man, and some of these issues that are key to Calvinism to adjust themselves. One of the things that happens in Georgia in the late 18th century, early 19th century, is that Methodists don't do very well. In fact, they do very badly. You have some of the great Francis Astor, the leaders in Georgia trying to promote Methodism in the mid 1790s, and they fail, and they fail because people prefer the Baptists. And one of the reasons they prefer Baptists is, and this is black and white in Georgia, tended to favor the Baptists because there was more local autonomy. They didn't like the idea of having an ecclesiological hierarchy that was controlling church. They liked the local autonomy that Baptist congregationalism provided for them. So it takes a while before the Methodists begin to come up with ways to speak a language that fits a more broadly Calvinistic outlook in that part of Georgia and then across the river in South Carolina. Episcopalians are even, they're fairly Calvinistic, though. We talked about Tinsley a while back, and a few days back, and he's criticizing the notion that God could create this war. But there's not a whole lot of shading. There's not a whole lot of difference in the way that Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians make the argument. They use the same texts and they reason in the same way about God's injunction. The thing that really binds them together is biblical literalism. Northern ministers and theologians had problems countering the pro-slavery theology for a very important reason, and that's because, read literally, the Bible is pro-slavery. There are multiple examples. The examples that these Southern ministers draw out are pretty clear. I mean, the Paul is very clear with Onesimus. On the positive side, positive injunction is very clear. Slavery is a part of both the Old and the New Testament, and it's really a fact, literally a biblical fact of life. So if you're reading the Bible in a literal way, then it's fairly straightforward to make the argument that the Bible is a pro-slavery document, no matter the denominational affiliation. Any other questions at this point, or you want to wait for the next one for the later on?
Yeah, I've got one more. The good question for the end is a post-war question.
Okay, good.
So let me know when you're ready for that. But here's another one. Did the pro-slavery theologians recognize or acknowledge the cognitive dissonance of using the Bible to stress the obedience of a slave while advocating revolution against the federal government?
That's a great question. Cognitive dissonance, no, because they believe that there was no. Well, let me get to Charles Colcock Jones, because he does. There is some cognitive dissonance with him, and how he deals with it's really interesting. So I think I can answer that question better by getting to Jones at the end here. So let's put that back just a bit. The second part of the question has to do with with rebellion against the federal government. What they're seeing, and I think we'll see some of this in Ives and Brooks here in just a minute. They're seeing and making the argument that the political leadership of the North is both subverting the Constitution and subverting biblical truth. This piece I'm going to talk about with Ives and Brooks, he deals with he's arguing against Henry Clay's colonizationist and emancipationist plans for Kentucky in 1851, and he makes it very clear that Clay and the abolitionists are friends of the devil, that they are not friends of God. So there's consistency throughout the argument, and they do blend very frequently with more secular, and we'll see this in Ives and Brooks, with more secular arguments like the mudsill theory of labor, and these ideas that slavery is a social positive good throughout, and so they're going to argue that the South is a superior society, that slavery is the only foundation for republicanism. The radicals and the fanatics of the North are the ones that are subverting the both true religion and constitutional liberty. And again, you see that argument made time and time again by political speakers who are advocating for secession. They see themselves very much as distinct people, and they're making the argument that they're distinct people. And the Southern ministers, again, of all stripes, are going to make the argument, we are the true biblical Christians in the United States. I hope that somewhat answered the question. We can come back and do a follow-up in a little bit if Jones and Brooks don't answer the question very clearly. So, barring any other questions, I want to keep moving and talk about Iverson Brooks. Rob, is it good for me to move on?
Go right ahead.
All right, thank you. So Iverson Brooks, he's a Baptist clergyman. He's a planter, not surprisingly. He's born in 1793. You remember last time, a time or two back, I made a lot about the generations and about the relative youth of the men who end up as Confederate chaplains. Notice that these leaders that we're talking about today are all born about the same time, at the end of the 18th century, and they make it through just through the beginning of the war or all the way through and shortly after the war. So these guys are the generation of teachers who are instructing these guys who become Confederate clergy. So that kind of points us towards the post-war question, and I think in a good way. But I do spend some time with that once it's appropriate. So anyway, he's born in Rockingham County, North Carolina. Once again, we have this North Carolina connection, and if you look at migration patterns in the South, and I say this pretty much every time I open my mouth and talk about Deep South Confederates, you didn't have to scratch very hard to find Alabama or South Carolina, Georgia, or North Carolina roots when you get into Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, Western Texas, Eastern Texas. That's where these people are from, and so it's not surprising. This is early on in this westward migration of Southern slave owners. So his parents were actually from Spotsylvania County, Virginia. Again, just kind of following this migratory pattern and these cultural influences that get translated from or transmitted from one part of the South to another. They moved to North Carolina. They're in Caswell County, North Carolina, at the beginning of the 19th century. He goes to a local academy. In 1812, he enlisted in the American Army and actually serves some minor duty during the War of 1812. Shortly thereafter, he goes to the University of North Carolina. And again, when we start seeing these guys going to the University of North Carolina, University of South Carolina, Princeton, these are very well educated individuals, and again, that holds true for the wartime generation of religious leaders. So, we need to think about. I think we always need to keep in mind how well trained and academically well trained these religious leaders in the South are or were. These are by and large not backwoods stump preaching ministers. These are guys who would be very comfortable in the highest levels of society anywhere in the United States. So there's definitely an elite leadership in the churches and the chaplaincy during the Confederate experience. Brooks graduates from the University of North Carolina in 1819. He's running with some pretty talented company. He becomes friends with James K. Polk and Thomas Hart Benton while he's at University of North Carolina. Stays friends with Polk through the rest of his life, or through the rest of Polk's life. And interestingly, so we're talking about 1819, 1820. 1818, 1819 here. Interestingly, Brooks gives a commencement address at the University of North Carolina, which is anti-slavery. complete 180 degrees from where he ends up. But in 1818, 1819, he's thinking about how slavery is damaging to the South, is damaging to the broader society, and that to continue, it's a very optimistic speech. Or I think it was the title. The title is "The State of the World Better in the Present Age Than Any Former Period?" And in Brooks, he thinks that things are pretty good, but they can get better. He thinks that slavery doesn't fit within this progressive view of the world. So, there is some room for anti-slavery thinking in the South, though it's not extensive, but there's certainly room for it in the 1810s and the 1820s. It's only when the plantation system takes off that you begin to see really serious rejections, and this is really late 18th century rejections of any evangelical anti-slavery. So it's a very interesting trajectory. We could maybe do another thing on that. 18th century anti-slavery Southern religion, which would be kind of an interesting thing. So in any case, he's got a long march to go from this very optimistic anti-slavery speech that he gives in 1819. Wasn't really sure what he wanted to do with his life when he finished school. He taught at a little academy in Greensboro, North Carolina, for a year or two after, that was his early professional career. It's important to note that Brooks became, while he was at the University of North Carolina, became friends with Basil Manley, and they remained close friends through the end of Brooks's life. So they had a fairly extensive correspondence, and certainly Manley has a deep influence over Brooks and Brooks's trajectory. And as they begin to strike up their friendship, Manley instructs Brooks that he should find a rich wife, somebody who had slaves and property, and that would lay the foundation for his future happiness. Manley also convinced him to become a Baptist minister. He's licensed to preach in 1819 at Manley's urging. He spends a year or so traveling around South Carolina as a domestic missionary, and then later settles in Eatonton, Georgia, which is just across the Savannah River from Edgehill District, South Carolina, and he runs the town's academy there in Eatonton. If you don't know that, that's where Joel Chandler Harris is from. The Uncle Remus stories come out of Eatonton, Georgia. If you find yourself in Eatonton, Georgia, you can go to the Uncle Remus Museum, which is one of the world's greatest roadside attractions. So next time you're in Eatonton, stop and see the Uncle Remus Museum. It is a really interesting experience. So anyway, he also is preaching at the local church. So there's this connection, right? You got educators and church leaders involved in articulating this pro-slavery. So while he's in Eatonton, he gets married. It's the first 3 marriages that Brooks has, and from that, he as Manley instructed, he found a rich one, and ended up controlling 3 plantations in Georgia, one in Putnam County, with Jasper County, and Jones County in Georgia. So he becomes a Baptist, and he marries into a plantation family, and then has control over 3 plantations, by the early 1830s. His second wife, his first wife dies. Second wife, married in 1828, got more property in Georgia, and ended up putting that property under guardianship for his son. So he was setting his son up for being a planter. His second wife died, marries the third time, and obtained property, 2 plantations in around Aiken, South Carolina, in the Edgehill District, just across the river from Augusta, Georgia. And from that period, from 1832 on, he lives in Woodville, South Carolina, just across the river from Augusta. near a little town called Hamburg, where the first functional railroad in the United States was built. About the same time, actually, that he moved there. Hamburg and Charleston Railroad, the first functioning railroad that carried cotton from Edgefield District down to the port of Charleston, rather than floating on the river down to Savannah. So another story, but it's part of the larger context that this plantation society is really moving towards maturity, and part of that maturation process is coming up with a system of religious thinking that defends it and positions it as God's just society. The only time that he leaves Woodville during the rest of his life, or any period of time, was 1842. He goes over to Penfield, Georgia, which is about 65, 70 miles as the crow flies from the river. He teaches at the Penfield Female Academy. Penfield Academy is or Mercer Institute is the primary Baptist college in Georgia at the time, and later moves to Macon and becomes what's now Mercer University. So he teaches at the Penfield Academy from 1842 to 1845. Again, he's in the circle with Adiel Sherwood and these others who are leading lights amongst Georgia Baptists and National Baptists. So very well connected individual, Brooks is. After 1845, when he goes back to Woodville, he continues to be a Baptist clergyman. He continues to preach in several churches in Edgefield District. But by and large, his primary work was being a plantation owner. And he was overseeing multiple properties in Georgia and in South Carolina, and most of his time was taken up there. But not surprisingly, as abolitionist rhetoric begins to rise in the North, Brooks speaks out strongly. He now has a vested interest in the institution. We don't know exactly how many enslaved people he owns, but on one of the plantations in 1861, there were 66 enslaved people. That's one of 5 or 6 different plantations that Brooks owns. So one could say that Manley influenced his thinking about the pro-slavery theology, and then his experience as a plantation owner and manager, and his investment, his wealth is all wrapped up in that. Certainly has some influence on the way that he sees the attacks of abolitionists in the ways that he responds. Because Brooks is an interesting defender of slavery, in that he blends the biblical stories and the biblical arguments with some politics. And even though Baptists didn't like to mix state and church, they certainly, at least in Brooks's case, certainly wasn't above engaging in political critique. The two, and the reason I say that is that 2 of his most famous pro-slavery tracts did deal with politics. It did deal with the political crisis of 1850. The first is called "The Defense of the South Against the Reproaches and Encroachments of the North" 1850, and the second was a defense of Southern slavery against the attacks of Henry Clay and Alexander Campbell. The latter was written published in 1851, and was written at the request of James Henry Hammond, the governor of South Carolina. So he's making a political statement and a political argument that he interweaves with a very robust pro-slavery theology. So the two get blended together in very interesting ways. And you can find the Defense of Southern Slavery Against the Attacks of Clay and Campbell on the Internet Archives. It's a really interesting read, and it's worth your time finding. I've got original copies of both of these documents laying on my desk. I'm show them. They're hard to pick up. They're really, really brittle because they're made of junk paper. I mean, this is popular local produced literature that you're looking at, which is another reason that I picked Brooks, is because he's not writing these big books that are published by printing houses in Philadelphia. These are things that are being run off at the Hamburg, South Carolina printing office, and the newspaper printing office, and then circulated locally. So again, getting at the local level of how this way of thinking developed and the way that it plays out. Now, that's not the full title, by the way, A Defense of Southern Slavery Against the Attacks of Henry Clay and Alexander Campbell, : and this is a great just summation. You probably don't even have to read the whole thing after you read the rest of the titles, in which much of the false philanthropy and mawkish sentimentalism of the abolitionists is met and refuted, in which it is moreover shown that the association of the white and black races in the relation of master and slave is the appointed order of God as set forth in the Bible, and constitutes the best social condition of both races and the only true principle of republicanism. That pretty much sums it up. That pretty much sums up the way that that Southern ministers were positioning themselves, and they were positioning themselves within both the religious context and broad politics. That's published in 1851. I want to read a little bit from it because it gives us it's dramatic language, it's jarring language. It's sometimes hard for me to even read, much less read out loud. But it's important to get a sense of the flavor of this writing to understand a little bit more fully the pro-slavery theology. And from the introduction, there's a little one-page introduction that's written, sort of an overture to it. It says, and so he's already engaged in a letter duel with Clay and some of his supporters in Kentucky. Has been involved in the political side of things, but now the governor of South Carolina has asked him to write it all down and put it in a pamphlet. And so the intro says, he now presents, and he is Brooks, he now presents these answers to the public in pamphlet form because he desires to cast the might of his influence into the scale of Southern righteousness crisis, and hopes this humble tract will assist Southerners to form a correct view of the rights and the rectitude of the institutions as appointed of God and sustained by the Bible. And then it goes on into the first couple of pages of the text, which is where the most robust deployment of his pro-slavery theology unfolds. He says, in regard to the scriptural view of slavery under the gospel dispensation, we asked Mr. Clay or any of his Northern associates to point us to a single precept or word uttered by Jesus Christ or his apostles prohibiting of slavery, or even past the first intimation of censure against the institution. But we ask also this point: if the omniscient Savior and his inspired apostles would have instituted regulations for the perpetual continuation of slavery, if they had not recognized the institution to be a blessing to a well-organized society, and that its tendency was to preserve liberty, rational and just, both in church and state. So he's using this negative space in the New Testament to show that there was plenty of opportunities for Jesus and his apostles to say no slavery, and they don't say it. It's a pretty powerful argument that he makes if you follow his reasoning. But he also employs the curse of Ham, so he uses both that negative space and the curse of Ham, and he uses it in a way that's very much echoes the scientific racism of the day, things that Josiah Nott and others are writing about. The biological and scientific inferiority of people of African descent. He says, so remember, the curse of Ham is this notion that one of Noah's sons is cursed, is then put to sub-Saharan Africa, and then those descendants are people who are rightly enslaved because they are to be subjects under the end of time. So this is how Brooks deploys the curse of Ham story in his argument against Clay. The curse gave the flat skull and other physical changes which stamp upon them inferiority of intellect, and their whole history has thus far shown them incapable of intellect, and has thus far shown them capable of self-government and to be constitutionally fitted to enjoy civil and religious freedom and its highest blessing to them only in the state of slavery or absolute servitude under the other races of Noah. So this curse of Ham concept provides racial component to the pro-slavery theology. And Brooks states it very, very brutally and very, very clearly. So in any case, this is the type of work that's being produced at the local level, is combining politics, is combining racial thinking, and using the really what become very familiar warrants for pro-slavery theology. Brooks continues to work through the Civil War. He owns 6 plantations or so, and he dies just before Lee surrenders. So his career ends at the very end of the Confederate war, and his influence is going to come through the people that he taught and the people that he preached to. By the way, many of the soldiers of the 1st South Carolina are from Edgefield District, South Carolina. There's no doubt these are the guys that captured the seminary. There are a lot of Edgefield guys on the seminary campus on July 1st. Rob, any questions right now? Because I'm going to try to scoot through Colcock Jones and then take some more.
No, no questions. I just got the last one that whenever you're ready for it. So go.
Okay. So Charles Colcock Jones, probably the most famous of the 4, because his family left some fantastic letters that were published back in the 1970s, and I'm suddenly forgetting the name of the Children of Pride is the name of the book. So it's a prize-winning set of letters and diaries from the Jones family that are well known to Southern historians especially. He's a son of a merchant. He's got deep roots in coastal Georgia. He's born in 1804. Again, all these guys are born about the same time. And he's born on his father's plantation in Liberty County, which is down south of Savannah, Georgia, on the Georgia coast. He makes his profession of faith at 17. He's a Presbyterian. Makes his profession of faith at 17, and then he goes to prepare for a life in Presbyterian ministry. And he leaves the South. He goes to Andover. First, he goes to Phillips Academy, then to Andover Theological Seminary, and finishes at Princeton Theological Seminary in 1830. 1846, he receives an honorary doctorate of divinity from Jefferson College in Canonsburg, Pennsylvania. So a very accomplished theologian and thinker, well known not just in Georgia and in the South, but also in the Northeast and in Pennsylvania. Jones is an interesting case because while he's in the North, he begins to really question the institution of slavery. He thinks that the Free Society of New England is superior to the Southern Society. He thinks that you can speak more freely, you can express unpopular views without being ostracized. You could even speak out against slavery without being under a physical threat or other types of threat. But he goes back to the South. He goes back to the South after developing an idea for a mission to the slaves. He creates a missionary society at Princeton, and then he is going to go back to Georgia, and he's going to work as a missionary amongst enslaved people for the rest of his life. Now, there are a few interruptions here. He teaches at the Columbia Theological Seminary in Columbia, South Carolina, from 1835 to 1838. Goes back to his missionary work in 1839, then shows back up at Columbia Theological Seminary from 1847 to 1850, and then goes to Philadelphia to serve as the corresponding secretary for the Board of Domestic Missions of the Presbyterian Church. He doesn't last long there. He is sick in 1853. His health fails, and he goes back to Liberty County. He's going to live the rest of his days in Liberty County, working within managing a couple plantations and also preaching and carrying out his missionary work. And he continues that till just about the day he dies. He writes during this time. He wrote a couple of important books. The most important, for our purposes, is called The Religious Instruction of the Negroes in the United States. It's published in 1842. And what he's trying to do in this document is to make an appeal to the slave owners that they needed to provide more religious instruction to slaves. And by doing that, bring slaves and whites together as a biracial community. They would be, as Presbyterian and Calvinism preaches, a superior and inferior, but the notion that there were reciprocal responsibilities and rights that accrued to both the masters and the enslaved was central to what Jones is trying to get at and what Jones is trying to achieve. It's a fascinating book. It's available at Doc South at the University of North Carolina Special Collections. And it's worth some serious consideration because he's really wrestling with this idea of trying to put into practice the idealized version of the plantation, trying to put in place this paternalistic, patriarchal family that worked together and that respected one another and functioned as Old Testament families. And this is what he's trying to achieve. The chapter titles, I think, are instructive and interesting to think about is part of his structuring here. Because remember, he's not just trying to convince enslaved people to become Christians. He's also trying to encourage masters to become Christians and then to take their duty as seriously, or Christian duty as seriously as he did. He was one of these super pietist social reformers, worked day and night, self-disciplined, all of the hallmarks of reforming the man were parts of how Cole Cup Jones lived his life. So he's trying to appeal to both the enslaved people. He sees the religious practices of enslaved people as being idolatrous, as being barbarism, does not have much respect, and this is not uncommon. Doesn't have much respect for the ways that enslaved people are practicing religion in the enslaved quarters themselves when left to their own devices to create the religious environments that ordered their lives and helped them understand cosmology and all this. So there's definitely a move to get rid of what Jones and other plantation owners would have seen oppositional cultural ideals within the quarters. He starts off with a long historical sketch of religious instruction to African Americans, going all the way back to 1620, all the way up to 1842, and he deals with the ways that the Anglican Church did or did not include people of African descent. And then now during the Revolutionary period, there are the creation of independent Black churches that there was certainly interest, kind of laying the groundwork for what he's going to want to do. But there's interest, but we have to get it right from his view. And so then he goes into a very long description of the moral and religious condition of the Negroes. And he doesn't have a whole lot of good to say in this. He certainly looks at the experiences in the slave quarters as being indicative of social degradation, and without the slightest bit of irony. Never the acknowledgement that perhaps the system is the problem. And all of these guys see individual piety as being the answer to the problem of slavery. That if you had good pious masters and good pious slaves who understood each other's right place in God's social order, then everything would be just fine. There's no questioning the rightness of the institution. They come at it from the perspective that this is a God-ordained institution and that we have to live out our individual lives in ways that are going to result in good things for masters and servants themselves. So he then goes on, talks about the obligations of the church to evangelize enslaved people. And this is, this is not just going to happen in Georgia, but this is going to be an idea that percolates through creating Sunday schools, creating context in which enslaved people can learn to read and write and learn catechisms and learn the basics of Presbyterianism. I would certainly put Stonewall Jackson Sunday School right in here with the as a part of the mission to the slaves that Jones articulates and that he speaks about pretty widely. And then he in the part 4 lays out a plan and a means to instruct folks, to create these Sunday schools, to create these institutions that want to help learn, help instruct both masters and servants, or masters and slaves, into their right duties under the Bible. Jones failed. This was not a successful missionary effort by and large. Certainly the enslaved rejected much of what's happening. You see this in the WPA slave narratives, especially Georgia, and you can see how this from the perspective of the enslaved certainly is a self-serving form of Christianity. You have to understand, the argument goes from this perspective, that God meant for you to be a slave, and that you owe me as the master the labor, and that certainly just does not fly in the slave quarters. Jones himself experiences this quite directly when he's preaching a sermon early in his career, probably 1840s. He's given a sermon or a lesson on one of his plantations, and he says that servants have to obey their masters, and the congregation got up and walked out. They just walked out. There's no fuller way of expressing one's rejection of the religious message than walking out of that church. And this is something that you see time and again in all Black churches in urban spaces like Savannah and Augusta, in Georgia, and you're starting to see by the 1950s the creation of independent or semi-autonomous all Black churches in the rural districts. And this never really catches this vision that Jones has for creating this beloved community never really takes off, never resonates, because it's trying to address a systemic issue and a systemic problem through individual means. So it's something that we need to think about, and I think perhaps down the road it'd be a good idea to do one of these events on the religious practices of enslaved people, and really look at the experience from the African American side of the coin, because certainly the messages that were coming from the white ministry were not resonating with their Black religionists. It certainly resonates though with many whites, especially in the slaveholding district. It gives a vision of a larger connectivity amongst white Christians, elevates whites. Again, we can go back to Renfro's sermon talking about how white people benefit from the system of slavery, and certainly seeing this as a institution ordained by God. It's a very important and very powerful way of understanding these works of social relations. Getting kind of long here, but it's a pretty big topic, and we've just barely brushed the very surface of this. But there are a few things I want to conclude with, and then I'll answer some questions. First is, so what kind of conclusions can we start to draw about this? And I think it's very clear from reading the documents themselves is that these ministers are looking for a way to create sustainability for a slave system, just as that slave system is being critiqued on the national and international stage. It's a very defensive move, and it is a way of thinking about at least creating the gloss of society that is bound together in Christian obligation and biblical with biblical foundations. And it's as simple as that. The second thing is that, and I've said this before, but I think it's important to keep it in mind, is that the justifications that these ministers develop are based on a literalist reading of the Bible. That it is And that literalist reading, this gets to that last question about the post-war period, that literalist way of reading the Bible is going to persist after the war. And some of this theology is going to persist through the war, and it's going to be propounded by the men who serve in Confederate clergy, the men who were trained by this generation that we're talking about today. And it doesn't, the theology doesn't disappear. This light switch doesn't get flipped and things change overnight. It persists for a long, long time in both a very practical way and also an intellectual way. The other thing that I think kind of comes out of this too is that there's a very hierarchical view of humanity that both secularly and religiously manifests in Southern life at this period. We can go back to the end of the Revolution and see that, and the religious notions that are expressed across the South and those that gain popularity build on that idea of social hierarchies. So there's a way of thinking that fits with the religion. There's a religion that fits with the way of thinking. There's a social system that fits, and these ministers are trying to put it all together and put these ideas into a divinely ordained society. And the last thing, there again, back to this notion that they're looking for some way to create order in the society, a very threatening society. Enslaved people express their resistance to the institution very directly by slowing down work, by feigning ignorance, by running away, by escaping. Running away and escaping is different experiences. Running away is resisting a job, and then coming back to the plantation sometime later. The enslaved people are certainly expressing themselves in religious services in forests and in the slave quarters themselves. So these ministers are trying to create some sort of common culture that's going to bind everyone black and white together, and it's going to erase the African and Afrocentric forms of religious expression. That's kind of an unstated objective of many of these pro-slavery theologians. So that's what we have. I know it's a whole lot, and I know there's a question, so I'm gonna stop and respond to the questions that Rob has on hand.
All right. So this last question is a three-part question.
Oh my.
So after the war, how is this theology packaged and adapted to support segregation and Jim Crow? Is it done explicitly and more subtly? And has any denomination officially repudiated these positions?
Well, let's start with the last part of the question first. The Southern Baptist Convention did not acknowledge its role in promoting pro-slavery theology until the 1990s. So it's been a very recent vintage that the Baptists acknowledged their part in supporting the slave system. But they have, and that has become very much a mainstream view, at least at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, Southwest Baptist Theological Seminary. So it's still there's still a reckoning, I think, of thinking through exactly what all of that means. The ideas of social inferiority that pervaded that were the foundations of the pro-slavery theology, especially as Brooks expressed it here, persists. There are attempts after the war of a part of white ministers to keep black congregants, because most religious practice in the antebellum South was biracial. Doesn't mean it was integrated, but black members and white members sat in the same building and listened to the same sermons. And when the sermons continued to have the tone of the pro-slavery theology within it, black members left, and they created their own independent churches. So there's a rejection of that pro-slavery theology, and particularly this vision of a shared community that white ministers wanted to create. This superior and inferior ruler and subject, which was what they continue to try to do. That they continue to try to to say God means for this to be hierarchical, and you're still, slavery ended, but you still are inferior racially. You're still inferior in your social practices, and you really need to continue to listen to us and to work towards integrating yourselves into this holy system. So, when Black members leave the church, the necessity for these ministers to remind the parishioners of that relationship begins to decline. But you're still seeing in Bibles and sermons and in tracts the notion that racial hierarchies are real. That the pro-slavery theology. I came across a couple of Bibles when I was researching my dissertation from Gwinnett County, Georgia, that had focused notes in the areas that had been used as pro-slavery documents or pro-slavery texts in the Bible. But these are Bibles that are published after 1870. So you've got the persistence of that thinking, and it certainly continues to influence the way that white Christians look at African Americans, and certainly continue to serve. Remember that these chaplains and these men who've learned from the guys we just talked about continue to have denominational authority all the way through the first part of the 20th century. So, the ways that they're trained. The literalism of biblical text continues to be a major theme within these denominations. So it doesn't change a whole lot. The legal system changes, but you can look at lost cause ideology and lost cause ideals, and there are always reasons why the Confederacy wasn't. Hey, we were wrong, and that persists way on into the 20th century. The rejection of white leadership, challenges to white authority through the 1880s through the 1960s and 70s were met with violence and met with condemnation from the pulpit. From Southern clergy. So it's not exactly the same. There's a lot that does change. Structurally in Southern religion, Southern white religion in the latter part of the 19th century, but it certainly continues to have that carry forward many of the more disturbing echoes of the pro-slavery theology, particularly the inferiority of African Americans. Is there a follow-up to that? Did I hit all of the points, or is there one more that I'm missing?
No, I believe you. I believe you hit them.
Okay.
So I think that's all for the comments.
Okay. No more questions. Okay. Well, that was a lot to get at, and it like I said, it really just kind of touches on the very highest points of what this system looked like and what this way of thinking looked like. So thank you for bearing with us. Hope to see you next week and in the coming weeks as we move through this shutdown. But these are going to be a part of our ongoing programming going forward, because they've been very, very, very successful and very, very interesting conversations to have. So y'all take care, be safe, and we'll see you next week. Take care.